The doors of Ashford Manor flew open before anyone could stop them, and the sound of boots striking marble echoed through the hall like a warning bell. Duke Damien Ashcombe did not wait to be announced. He walked in with his jaw tight and his eyes burning with a fury that had been building for 3 days, ever since the letter arrived, ending his engagement without warning or apology. Lord Edmund Ashford rose from his chair so quickly that it toppled behind him. Lady Margaret pressed a hand to her chest, and the servants near the entrance froze in place, unsure whether to bow or run. "Your Grace," Lord Edmund said, his voice shaking despite his effort to sound calm. "We did not expect you this evening." "No," Damien said, his voice low and controlled in a way that felt more dangerous than shouting. "I imagine you did not expect me at all. You hoped I would simply accept the insult and disappear quietly, so your family could pretend none of this ever happened." Clarissa, the eldest daughter of the house, stood near the window with her arms folded. She was beautiful, in the practiced way of someone who had learned early that beauty could open doors that words could not. She did not look ashamed. She looked irritated, as though the Duke's presence was an inconvenience rather than a consequence. "I did what was best for me," she said simply. "You cannot fault a woman for changing her mind before a wedding, not after it." "I do not fault you for changing your mind," Damien said, turning his gaze on her at last. "I fault you for doing it, in a letter delivered by a servant, after the invitations had already been sent to every noble family in the region. You made me a fool in front of people whose respect I have spent years earning." Lord Edmund tried again. "Your Grace, we are prepared to offer compensation. Land, gold, whatever restores your honor in the eyes of society. Name your price, and it is yours." Damien let out a short, humorless laugh. "You think this is about gold?" The room went silent. Even the fire in the hearth seemed to dim, as if it understood the weight pressing down on the air. "I want a wife," Damien said. "That was the arrangement, and I intend to honor it, even if your daughter does not, but not her." He nodded toward Clarissa, without even looking at her again. "She has made her feelings clear. I would rather marry a woman who has not spent years perfecting the art of humiliating people who trust her." Lady Margaret's face went pale. "Your Grace, we have no other daughter of proper age to—" "You have another daughter," Damien interrupted. "The youngest, the one I have heard mentioned perhaps twice since I began courting this family, always in a hushed voice, always followed by a change of subject." Lord Edmund's expression shifted, just slightly, into something closer to panic. She is not well suited for marriage, Your Grace. She is frail. She keeps to herself. She would not make a proper duchess." "That is precisely why I want her," Damien said, and something cold settled into his voice, a decision already made long before he walked through the door. "Your family wounded my pride in front of everyone who matters to me. I intend to return the favor in a way you will feel far more deeply than gold ever could. I will take the daughter you are ashamed of, the one you have hidden away like a secret, and I will make her a duchess. Let all of society ask why the frail, forgotten Ashford girl was chosen over her celebrated sister. Let them whisper about what that says of this family." "Please," Lady Margaret whispered. "There must be another way." "There is no other way," Damien said. "You broke the agreement first. I am simply choosing how it ends." Lord Edmund's hands trembled at his sides. He looked toward the staircase, toward the shadowed hallway that led to the east wing of the house, where his youngest daughter had spent most of her life away from guests, away from gatherings, away from anything that required her to be seen. He knew there was no argument that would move the Duke. Nobles who felt betrayed did not change their minds out of pity, and Damien's reputation for stubborn resolve was well known throughout the region. "Bring her down," Lord Edmund said quietly to a servant standing near the stairs. Nora, one of the younger maids, hesitated before nodding and disappearing up the staircase. The manor felt heavier with every passing second, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Clarissa, still by the window, finally allowed a small, satisfied smile to cross her face. Whatever guilt she might have carried for breaking the engagement seemed to vanish the moment she realized the consequences would fall on someone else entirely. Minutes passed in silence. Damien did not sit. He stood in the center of the hall with his arms crossed, watching the staircase, the way a man watches an opponent he has already decided to defeat. When Alara finally appeared at the top of the stairs, The entire room seemed to shift its attention toward her, though she gave them very little reason to stare. She was thin, with pale skin and quiet eyes that held none of her sister's practiced charm. Her hair was pulled back simply, and her dress, plain compared to Clarissa's, hung slightly loose on her frame, as though it had been made for a version of her that ate more, slept better, and worried less. She walked down the stairs slowly, not out of fear, but with the careful, measured steps of someone who had learned long ago that sudden movements could cost her dearly, whether through illness or through the sharp words of a household that rarely had patience for weakness. When she reached the bottom step, she looked at her parents first, then at Damien, and finally at her sister, who refused to meet her gaze. "Elara," Lord Edmund said, his voice strained, "the Duke has asked for your hand in marriage." If the words shocked her, she did not show it. Her expression remained calm, almost distant, as though she had long ago trained herself not to react to sudden turns in her family's plans for her life. "I see," she said quietly. Damien studied her carefully, searching for the tears, the pleading, the desperate protest he expected from a girl being handed over as punishment for a sister's mistake. He found none of it. Her calmness unsettled him more than any outburst could have. "Do you understand what is being asked of you?" he said, his voice sharper than he intended. "I understand that my family has made a decision," Elara said, "and that I am expected to accept it, as I always have." Her words were not defiant, yet they carried a quiet weight that made several people in the room shift uncomfortably. Lady Margaret looked away. Lord Edmund stared at the floor. "You do not object?" Damien asked. "Would it matter if I did?" Elara replied, and for the first time, something flickered behind her eyes, something that looked almost like exhaustion rather than sadness. Damien did not have an answer for that. He had walked into the manor prepared for tears, prepared for resistance, prepared for a victory that would sting the family the way their betrayal had stung him. Instead, he found himself facing a young woman who seemed to expect nothing better from the world, and that realization sat uneasily in his chest, though he refused to let it show. "The wedding will take place within the week," he said, turning to Lord Edmund. "I trust you will not attempt to delay it, or find some excuse to change your mind again." "Of course not, Your Grace," Lord Edmund said quickly. "Everything will be arranged as you wish." Damien gave one final look toward Elara before turning to leave. She had not moved from the bottom step, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her expression unreadable. As he walked past her toward the door, he caught the faintest scent of something medicinal, herbs perhaps, the kind used to ease pain or fever, and he wondered briefly what illness required such treatment so often that its scent lingered on her skin. He pushed the thought aside. This was not a marriage born of concern or curiosity. It was a punishment, carefully chosen to wound a family that had wounded him first. Whatever frailty Elara carried was simply a tool, a detail that made his revenge more effective, nothing more. Or so he told himself as he stepped out into the cold evening air, the manor doors closing heavily behind him. Inside, Elara remained on the stairs a moment longer before Nora approached her gently, guiding her back up toward her room. Neither Lord Edmund nor Lady Margaret followed to comfort her. Clarissa had already turned away, discussing something with a servant, as though nothing of consequence had just happened in the room around her. Only Nora, walking beside Elara up the quiet staircase, noticed the way her mistress's hands trembled slightly, once she believed no one important was watching. It was a small thing, easy to miss, but Nora had worked in the household long enough to recognize the difference between fear and something deeper, something that had been carefully hidden for years behind a calm face and quiet words. "My lady," Nora said softly, once they reached the hallway, "are you frightened?" Elara paused at the door to her room, her hand resting on the frame. "Frightened is not quite the word," she said. "I have been afraid of many things in this house for a long time. A husband who wants nothing more than my presence to prove a point may, in truth, be the easiest fear I have ever faced." Nora did not understand the full weight of those words, but something in Elara's tone made her uneasy, as though there were entire chapters of her mistress's life that had never been spoken aloud, buried carefully beneath years of silence and obedience. Elara stepped into her room and closed the door quietly behind her, leaving Nora standing in the hallway, staring after her, with a growing sense that whatever waited for Elara at the Duke's estate might be far less frightening than whatever she had already survived within these walls. Downstairs, the manor slowly returned to its normal rhythm, servants resuming their duties, Lord Edmund pouring himself a drink with an unsteady hand, and Clarissa retreating to her room, without a single word of concern for the sister she had just condemned to a marriage built entirely on revenge. None of them noticed, or perhaps none of them wished to notice, the small marks on Alara's wrist as she had lifted her hand to the doorframe, marks that told a story none of them had ever bothered to ask about, and a truth that would soon reach far beyond the walls of Ashford Manor. The carriage that carried Alara away from Ashford Manor rattled steadily along the country road, its wheels catching on stones and dips that seemed to echo every uncertain thought in her mind. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, watching the fields blur past the window. Fields she had rarely seen up close since her illness years ago, had convinced her family that fresh air and long journeys were too dangerous for someone as fragile as she supposedly was. Nora sat across from her, chosen at the last moment to accompany her mistress to the Duke's estate, though even that arrangement had been granted grudgingly by Lady Margaret, who seemed more concerned with how quickly she could erase her youngest daughter from daily conversation than with how she might fare in a strange household. "You are quiet, my lady," Nora said gently, breaking the long silence that had settled between them since leaving the manor. "I am thinking," Alara replied, her eyes still fixed on the passing countryside. "About the Duke?" "About everything," Alara said. "About how strange it is that the same family who kept me hidden away for years suddenly found it so easy to hand me over to a man they know nothing about, simply because it solved a problem for them." Nora hesitated before speaking again. "Perhaps it will be different there. Perhaps the Duke, once his anger cools, will see you are not what he expects." Alara turned to look at her, and there was something gently sad in her expression, though her voice remained steady. "He does not want to see me at all, Nora. He wants to see my family suffer through me. I am simply the instrument he has chosen." The carriage rolled on for hours, the scenery shifting from open farmland to denser forest, and finally to the looming silhouette of Ashcombe Estate rising against the darkening sky. The building was larger than Ashford Manor by a considerable measure, its stone walls tall and imposing, its windows glowing faintly with candlelight that did little to soften its cold, formal appearance. When the carriage finally stopped, a line of servants had already gathered near the entrance, standing in stiff formation, as though preparing to greet visiting royalty rather than a new mistress of the house. Alara stepped down slowly, her legs slightly unsteady after the long journey, and Nora moved quickly to her side to offer support, though Alara straightened herself before anyone else could notice. A tall, stern-faced man stepped forward from the group of servants, introducing himself as Colin, the estate's head steward. His expression was polite but distant, the look of a man accustomed to following orders precisely, rather than offering warmth to those who did not seem likely to remain important for long. "Welcome to Ashcombe Estate, my lady," Colin said, bowing slightly. "His Grace has instructed that you be shown to your chambers immediately. He is occupied with matters of the estate this evening." Alara nodded, unsurprised by the lack of a personal welcome from the man who had, only days earlier, stormed into her family's home to claim her as a form of punishment. "Thank you, Colin. Lead the way." The inside of the estate was grand, in the way that old noble houses often were, filled with portraits of stern ancestors, polished floors that echoed every footstep, and hallways lined with tall windows that let in long stretches of moonlight. Yet despite its grandeur, there was a coldness to the place that Alara noticed almost immediately, a lack of warmth that seemed to seep into the walls themselves. Colin led her through several corridors before arriving at a narrow staircase leading toward the east wing, far from the main living quarters of the house. The chamber they eventually reached was modest, smaller than the rooms Alara had passed along the way, though clean and quietly furnished. "This will be your room, my lady," Colin said. "If you require anything, you may ring for a servant, though I must inform you that His Grace has requested minimal disturbance to his daily routines." Alara understood the message clearly enough. She was not meant to feel welcomed. She was meant to remain quiet, distant, and easily overlooked, much as she had been in her own family's home. The irony of it was not lost on her, though she said nothing of it aloud. "That will be fine," she said simply. "Thank you, Colin." Once he departed, Nora began unpacking the small number of belongings Alara had brought with her. mostly simple dresses, and a few personal items that held sentimental value rather than material worth. Alara moved toward the window instead, looking out over the estate's grounds, where a garden stretched below, overgrown in places but clearly once carefully tended. "It is beautiful," she murmured, almost to herself. "The garden, my lady?" Nora asked. "Yes, it seems no one has cared for it in some time." Over the following days, Alara settled into a quiet routine that mirrored much of her life before marriage, though the surroundings were unfamiliar. She rose early, ate simply, and spent much of her time in her chamber, or, when she felt strong enough, walking slowly through the neglected garden below her window. The staff regarded her with a mixture of curiosity and caution, unsure how to treat a woman who had clearly been brought into the household under unusual circumstances, yet who carried herself with none of the fear or desperation they might have expected. Damien, true to Colin's warning, remained almost entirely absent from her daily life. He conducted his affairs in other parts of the estate, attended to matters of business and politics that kept him occupied from early morning until late evening, and made no effort to seek her out beyond ensuring that her basic needs were met. It was, in many ways, exactly the kind of isolation Alara had grown accustomed to throughout her life, though something about this particular loneliness felt heavier, layered with the added weight of being used deliberately as a tool for someone else's satisfaction. Still, she did not complain. She did not send word to her family asking for reconsideration, nor did she plead with the household staff for kindness she suspected they were not permitted to offer freely. Instead, she focused her limited energy on small tasks, tending gently to the garden's most neglected corners, mending a torn curtain in her chamber, and speaking softly with Nora in the evenings about nothing of great importance, simply to fill the silence with something other than her own thoughts. One afternoon, nearly a week after her arrival, Alara ventured further into the garden than she had before, drawn by the sight of a small stone bench nearly hidden beneath overgrown vines. She settled onto it carefully, enjoying the rare warmth of sunlight against her skin, when the sound of approaching footsteps startled her. Damien appeared at the edge of the garden path, clearly having taken the route by habit rather than intention, and stopped abruptly upon seeing her seated there. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching awkwardly between them, as though neither had expected to encounter the other so directly. "You are in the garden," he said finally, his tone somewhere between observation and mild surprise. "I am," Alara replied simply. "I hope that is not against your wishes as well." Something in her tone, quiet, yet carrying the faintest edge of dry humor, caused Damien to pause. He studied her for a moment, taking in the pale color of her skin against the greenery around her, the careful way she held herself even while seated, as though bracing constantly against some unseen discomfort. "The garden is yours to use as you wish," he said eventually. "I was simply not expecting anyone to be here." "It seemed a shame to let it go entirely wild," Alara said, glancing toward a nearby rosebush she had trimmed carefully that morning. "Someone clearly cared for it once." Damien's jaw tightened slightly at her words, though he said nothing about the memory that briefly surfaced, a memory of his mother tending these same roses many years earlier, before illness had taken her from the estate entirely. He was not prepared to share such thoughts with a woman he had married purely out of anger, and he quickly redirected the conversation. "You should not overexert yourself," he said instead, his voice regaining its earlier coolness. "I was told you are frail. I would prefer you not collapse in my garden and give the staff cause for concern." Alara's expression remained calm, though something flickered briefly behind her eyes at his words. "I assure you, Your Grace, I am quite capable of sitting on a bench without collapsing." There was a quiet firmness in her voice that surprised him, a subtle strength beneath her soft tone that did not match the fragile image he had constructed of her before their marriage. He found himself studying her a moment longer than necessary, before finally turning to continue on his way. "See that you do not overdo it," he said, and then he was gone, his footsteps fading down the garden path as quickly as they had arrived. Alara remained seated a while longer, watching the space where he had stood, an unreadable expression settling over her features. She had expected coldness from him, had prepared herself for isolation and indifference, yet something about the brief exchange left her with an unfamiliar sensation, a small crack of curiosity about the man who had claimed her as punishment, yet seemed almost startled by her quiet resilience. That evening, as Nora helped her prepare for bed, Ilara found herself glancing toward the small mirror in her room, studying her own reflection with a thoughtfulness she rarely allowed herself. She traced her fingers lightly over the faint marks on her wrist, hidden easily beneath the long sleeves she always wore, remnants of a childhood illness that had left more than physical scars behind. She did not know what the coming months would bring within these unfamiliar walls, married to a man who wanted nothing from her but a symbol of revenge. Yet as she settled into bed that night, staring up at the unfamiliar ceiling above her, she allowed herself a single quiet thought, one she had not permitted in a long time. Perhaps, within this cold and distant household, there might yet be room for something unexpected to grow, much like the garden she had begun, quietly and carefully, to bring back to life. Weeks passed at Ashcombe Estate, and life settled into a strange, quiet rhythm that neither Damien nor Ilara openly acknowledged, though both felt its presence in different ways. Damien continued to keep his distance, burying himself in correspondence, estate matters, and long rides across his lands that kept him away from the house for most of each day. Ilara, for her part, remained largely within the boundaries he had set for her, though she had begun to expand her small world in quiet, careful ways that no one seemed to notice at first. She had taken over the garden almost entirely now, clearing overgrown paths, trimming hedges that had been neglected for years, and coaxing the rose bushes back into bloom with a patience that surprised even Nora, who often joined her in the mornings before the day's heat grew too strong. The staff, initially uncertain how to treat the new Duchess, had slowly begun to warm to her presence, drawn in by her quiet kindness, and the way she never demanded anything beyond what was necessary. One young stable boy, barely 12 years old, had taken to leaving small wildflowers near the garden bench each morning, a silent gesture of gratitude after Ilara had noticed him struggling with a heavy load of firewood one afternoon and quietly arranged for extra help without ever mentioning it to anyone in the household who might have questioned her involvement. Despite these small pockets of warmth, Ilara's nights remained difficult. The illness that had plagued her since childhood had not vanished simply because she now lived in a different house. It returned in waves, sometimes mild, a persistent weakness in her limbs and a tightness in her chest, and sometimes severe enough that she found herself gripping the edge of her bed in the darkness, counting slowly under her breath, a technique she had developed years earlier to steady herself through moments when calling for help seemed pointless, since no one in her family's house had ever come quickly enough to matter. It was during one such night that Damien, returning late from a ride that had taken him further than intended, passed by the east wing, on his way to his own chambers, and paused outside Ilara's door, drawn by a faint, rhythmic sound he could not immediately identify. He stood still for a long moment, listening carefully, and realized with growing unease that the sound was Ilara's voice, quiet and strained, counting steadily, as though bracing herself through something painful. He raised his hand to knock, then hesitated, uncertain whether intruding on what was clearly a private struggle would be welcomed or resented. After a moment of internal debate, he lowered his hand and instead remained standing outside the door until the counting eventually slowed and then stopped entirely, replaced by the quiet sound of steady breathing that suggested she had finally settled. He told himself, as he continued down the hallway toward his own chambers, that his concern meant nothing beyond simple household responsibility. A duchess who fell seriously ill under his roof would reflect poorly on his household, nothing more. Yet the image of her voice, strained yet controlled, counting through whatever pain had gripped her in the darkness, lingered in his mind long after he had settled into his own bed. The following morning, Damien found himself watching Ilara more closely than he had allowed himself to before. She appeared at breakfast slightly later than usual, her movements a touch slower, her face paler than the previous day, though she said nothing of it, and offered no explanation when Colin inquired politely about her well-being. "You seem tired this morning," Damien said, unable to stop the words before they left his mouth, surprising even himself with the observation. Ilara glanced up from her plate, clearly startled that he had spoken to her directly at breakfast, something he had rarely done since her arrival. "I did not sleep particularly well," she admitted simply. "It happens from time to time. It is nothing of concern." "You were counting," Damien said, before he could stop himself, immediately regretting the admission that he had been standing outside her door the previous night. Alara's expression shifted subtly, a flicker of surprise quickly smoothed over by her usual calm composure. "You heard that?" "I was passing by," he said, his tone defensive despite himself. "I did not mean to intrude." "It is a habit," Alara said after a moment, her voice quiet but steady. "Counting helps distract the mind from discomfort. I have done it since I was a child." Damien studied her carefully, noting the careful way she chose her words, offering just enough information to satisfy a question, without revealing anything further. "What sort of discomfort?" he asked, genuinely curious, despite his earlier resolve to remain distant from her circumstances. "The kind that comes and goes," Alara said simply. "I have learned to manage it in my own way. There is no need for concern, Your Grace." Her deflection was polite but firm, closing the conversation as effectively as a door swinging shut, and Damien, though curious, did not press further, sensing that whatever lay beneath her calm exterior was not something she intended to share easily, especially not with a husband who had made his intentions toward her painfully clear from the very beginning. Still, the exchange lingered with him throughout the day, distracting him during meetings with estate managers and conversations with visiting nobles, until finally, unable to focus properly on the ledgers spread before him, he set his work aside and made his way toward the garden, drawn by an impulse he did not fully understand. He found Alara there, seated on the same stone bench where they had first spoken weeks earlier, a book resting unopened in her lap as she watched the late afternoon light filter through the trees above. "You seem to enjoy this garden a great deal," he said, approaching slowly. "It is peaceful here," Alara replied, glancing up at him with mild surprise at his unexpected presence. "And it gives me something useful to do with my time, rather than simply waiting within these walls." "Waiting for what?" Damien asked, settling onto the far end of the bench without quite realizing he had chosen to sit rather than simply speak and leave, as had become his habit. Alara considered the question carefully before answering. "I suppose I have spent much of my life waiting for something to change, though I could never quite say what that something was. My family waited for me to become stronger, so they might present me properly to society. I waited for my illness to pass entirely, so I might finally live without limitation. Neither of those things ever happened as expected, so I have learned instead to find small purposes within whatever circumstances I am given." Her honesty caught him off guard, more direct than anything she had offered him since their marriage began. He studied her carefully, noting the quiet resignation in her voice, though it carried none of the bitterness he might have expected from someone treated so poorly by her own family. "Your family speaks of you rarely," Damien said. "When they do, it is always with a certain discomfort. They find me inconvenient," Alara said simply, without apparent distress at the admission. "I required more attention as a child than my sister did, more visits from physicians, more careful monitoring of my activities. It became easier for them, I think, to simply set me aside, both from their conversations and from their expectations." "That seems remarkably unkind," Damien said, surprised by the sharpness of his own reaction to her words. Alara offered a small, humorless smile. "Kindness was never something I expected from my family, Your Grace. I learned long ago to require very little from others, so that disappointment would have less room to grow." Her words settled uncomfortably in Damien's chest, stirring something he had not anticipated when he first demanded her hand in marriage as an act of vengeance. He had imagined, in his anger, that taking the frail, forgotten daughter would wound the Ashford family deeply, using her as a symbol of their shame. He had not considered, until this moment, what it might mean for a person to have spent her entire life being treated as something disposable, something to be hidden away rather than valued. "I did not marry you out of any consideration for your well-being," he admitted, after a long pause, choosing honesty over the coldness he usually maintained. "I wanted to hurt your family, and you were simply the means by which I could do so most effectively." "I am aware of that," Alara said, her voice steady, despite the blunt admission. "I have never mistaken your actions for kindness, Your Grace. I understood exactly what this marriage was meant to accomplish from the moment my parents called me down those stairs." Her clarity, delivered without anger or self-pity, left Damien oddly unsettled. He had expected, perhaps even hoped in some small way, that she might resent him for what he had done, that her frailty might manifest as fragile emotion he could dismiss easily. Instead, he found himself facing a quiet, steady honesty that made his earlier intentions feel suddenly small and unworthy of the woman sitting beside him. "And yet you do not seem to hate me for it," he said. "Hatred requires energy I would rather spend elsewhere," Ilara replied simply. "I have found, over the years, that surviving each day matters far more than dwelling on who has wronged me and why. You wanted to punish my family, and perhaps you have, but I intend to live my own life within whatever circumstances I am given, regardless of the reasons that brought me here." They sat together in silence for a long moment after that, the garden around them settling into the soft gold light of late afternoon, neither quite willing to break the quiet understanding that had settled between them, however uneasy and unfamiliar it felt to both of them. Eventually, Damien rose to leave, pausing only briefly before speaking again. "If the discomfort returns tonight," he said, his voice quieter than before, "you need not manage it entirely alone. I will have Colin send for a physician, should you require one." Ilara looked up at him, clearly surprised by the offer, though she said nothing beyond a simple nod of acknowledgement before he turned and walked back toward the house, leaving her alone once more among the roses she had worked so carefully to bring back to life. The physician arrived at Ashcombe Estate on a gray, overcast morning, summoned quietly by Damien without any public announcement to the household staff. His name was Dr. Whitfield, an older man with graying hair and steady hands who had served the Ashcombe family for many years, treating everything from minor injuries among the stable workers to more serious ailments among the household's senior members. Damien met him privately in the study before allowing him anywhere near Ilara's chambers, wanting to explain the situation carefully before any examination took place. "My wife suffers from some manner of chronic illness," Damien said, standing near the window with his arms crossed. "She manages it herself, largely, and rarely speaks of its specifics. I want you to examine her thoroughly, and I want an honest assessment of her condition, regardless of whether she chooses to share it with me herself." Dr. Whitfield studied the Duke carefully before responding. "Your Grace, if the lady does not wish to disclose the details of her health to you, it may not be entirely proper for me to do so on her behalf. I am not asking you to betray her trust unnecessarily," Damien said, his tone firm but not unkind. "I simply wish to understand what she is dealing with, so that I might ensure she receives proper care within this household. If there is something within your professional discretion that you believe I should know for her safety, I trust you to use your judgment." The physician nodded slowly, accepting the reasoning, though something in his expression suggested he understood there was more beneath the Duke's request than simple household concern. Nora escorted Dr. Whitfield to Ilara's chambers a short while later, and though Ilara appeared initially hesitant at the unexpected visit, she agreed to the examination without significant protest, perhaps sensing that resistance would only invite further questions she preferred to avoid. The examination took nearly an hour, conducted with careful professionalism as Dr. Whitfield asked gentle questions about her symptoms, her history, and the treatments she had received over the years. Ilara answered honestly, though briefly, offering only the details necessary to satisfy his medical curiosity, without elaborating on the emotional weight behind much of what she described. When the examination concluded, Dr. Whitfield made his way back to the study, where Damien waited with barely concealed impatience. "Well?" Damien asked as soon as the door closed behind the physician. Dr. Whitfield took a moment before answering, choosing his words with obvious care. "Your Grace, the Duchess suffers from a condition affecting her heart, one that likely developed during a severe illness in her childhood. It causes periodic weakness, difficulty breathing under strain, and occasional pain that she describes as manageable, though I suspect she has learned to endure a great deal more discomfort than she lets on." "Is it dangerous?" Damien asked, his voice tighter than he intended. "It requires careful management," Dr. Whitfield said. "Overexertion, extreme stress, and lack of proper rest can worsen her episodes considerably. With proper care, however, there is no reason she cannot live a long, reasonably comfortable life." Damien absorbed this information slowly, relief and concern mixing uneasily within him. "You said she has learned to endure more than she lets on. What do you mean by that specifically?" The physician hesitated, clearly debating how much to share. "During my examination, Your Grace, I notice certain marks on her body, old scars, that suggest her illness was not always managed with the care it required. Some appear consistent with falls, likely from episodes of weakness that went unassisted. Others," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "suggest treatments administered without proper medical guidance, perhaps by someone within her household attempting remedies beyond their expertise, possibly out of frustration or impatience with her condition." Damien's jaw tightened as understanding settled over him slowly. "You are suggesting her family did not simply neglect her illness. You are suggesting they mishandled it." "I cannot say with certainty what occurred within the Ashford household," Dr. Whitfield said carefully. "But the evidence on her body suggests years of insufficient and, at times, improper care for a condition that required far greater attention and gentleness than she appears to have received." The physician's words settled heavily in the room, and Damien found himself recalling the marks he had glimpsed on Alara's wrist during their very first meeting, marks he had dismissed at the time as inconsequential details in his pursuit of revenge against her family. Now, hearing them described with medical clarity, they took on a far more troubling significance. "Thank you, Dr. Whitfield," Damien said finally, his voice quieter than before. "I would ask that you make yourself available, should the Duchess require further care in the future. And I would ask that this conversation remain between us." "Of course, Your Grace," the physician said, gathering his things to leave. "For what it is worth, the Duchess struck me as remarkably resilient, given everything her body has endured. Whatever difficulties she has faced, she has clearly found ways to survive them that most people would find difficult to imagine." After the physician departed, Damien remained alone in his study for a long while, staring at nothing in particular, as the weight of what he had learned settled uncomfortably over him. He had married Alara believing her frailty to be little more than a convenient detail, a symbol he could use to wound her family more effectively. He had not considered, in his anger, what it might mean that her frailty was not simply an inconvenience to her family, but potentially the result of years of inadequate, perhaps even harmful, treatment at their hands. That evening, he found himself walking toward the East Wing once more, drawn by an unfamiliar mixture of guilt and concern he had not expected to feel toward the woman he had claimed purely out of spite. He found Alara in her chamber, seated near the window, with a book open in her lap, though her eyes seemed distant, as though her thoughts had wandered far from the pages before her. "The physician tells me, your condition can be managed with proper care," Damien said, standing near the doorway. Alara looked up, slightly startled by his presence. "Yes, that has always been true, provided the proper care is actually given." Her words carried a subtle edge that Damien had not heard from her before, a hint of something bitter beneath her usual calm composure. "Was it not given, in your family's household?" he asked carefully. Alara studied him for a long moment before answering, as though deciding how much honesty this conversation warranted. "My family believed, for many years, that my illness was largely a matter of willpower. When I grew weak, they encouraged me to push through it. When I collapsed, they attributed it to laziness or dramatics, rather than genuine physical limitation. It was easier for them to believe I simply lacked the strength of character my sister possessed, than to accept that I was dealing with something beyond my control." "And when you needed actual medical treatment?" Damien asked, his voice tight with restrained anger on her behalf. "Physicians were called when absolutely necessary," Alara said, "though my parents often disagreed with their recommendations, believing certain remedies to be excessive or unnecessary. There were times I was left to manage severe episodes largely on my own, simply because calling for help had, in the past, resulted in more frustration directed at me than actual assistance." Her calm delivery of such painful information struck Damien more deeply than any tears or dramatic confession might have. He realized, standing there in the doorway of her chamber, that her quiet composure was not the absence of pain, but rather the result of having learned, through years of disappointment, that expressing pain rarely brought the relief or comfort a person might reasonably expect. "That will not happen here," Damien said finally, his voice firmer than he intended. "Whatever this marriage began as, you will not be left to manage serious illness entirely alone within these walls. Dr. Whitfield will remain available to you whenever needed, and you are to send for him immediately should you require assistance, regardless of the hour." Alara studied him carefully, clearly surprised by the intensity of his declaration. "That is a kind offer, Your Grace, though I admit I am uncertain what has prompted such a shift in your attitude toward me." Damien hesitated, unwilling to fully explain the guilt now settling uncomfortably in his chest, the growing awareness that his desire for revenge had blinded him to the reality of the person he had married. "Perhaps," he said finally, "I am beginning to understand that punishing your family does not require punishing you as well." Alara's expression softened slightly at his words, though she said nothing further, simply nodding in quiet acknowledgement, before returning her attention to the book in her lap. Damien remained a moment longer, watching her carefully, before finally turning to leave, his mind now occupied with thoughts far different from the anger and vengeance that had brought them together in the first place. As he made his way back through the quiet hallways of his estate, Damien found himself reconsidering, for the first time since their marriage began, exactly what kind of man he wished to be within these walls, and exactly what kind of husband the woman he had married out of spite truly deserved. Curiosity, once it had taken root in Damien's mind, proved difficult to dismiss entirely. In the days following Dr. Whitfield's examination, he found himself increasingly preoccupied with questions about Alara's past, questions that extended beyond simple concern for her physical health and into a deeper wish to understand exactly what kind of household had shaped the quiet, resilient woman now living within his own walls. He began his inquiries carefully, first speaking with an old family friend who had maintained ties with several noble houses in the region, including the Ashfords, over many years. The conversation took place over drinks in Damien's study, framed casually as idle curiosity, rather than the deliberate investigation it truly was. The Ashford family, his friend, a man named Lucas who had known Damien since childhood, said thoughtfully. An interesting household, that one. Lord Edmund built quite a reputation for himself in his younger years, though much of the family's standing these days rests on Clarissa's charm and beauty rather than any particular achievement of her father's. "And the younger daughter?" Damien asked, keeping his tone deliberately light. "Ilara?" Lucas frowned slightly, considering the name. "Ah, yes, the sickly one. I recall very little about her, actually. She was rarely present at social gatherings, even as a child. There were whispers, years ago, that she nearly died from a fever that swept through the household when she was quite young. Her sister and several servants fell ill as well, though Ilara's case was reportedly the most severe. What happened after her recovery?" Damien pressed carefully. "I could not say with certainty," Lucas admitted. "The family simply stopped mentioning her much after that. It was as though, having survived something so serious, she became something of an embarrassment to them, rather than a cause for celebration. I always found that rather strange myself." Damien absorbed this information quietly, filing it away, alongside what he already knew, though it left him with more questions than answers. He continued his inquiries over the following days, speaking discreetly with other acquaintances who had some connection to the Ashford household, gradually piecing together a picture that troubled him more with each new detail he uncovered. One conversation, with an elderly noblewoman who had once served as a distant relative's companion within the Ashford household many years earlier, proved particularly revealing. She spoke carefully, clearly uncomfortable discussing matters she considered private, though Damien's status as the girl's new husband seemed to loosen her reluctance somewhat. "The illness that struck young Ilara was severe indeed," the woman said, her voice quiet despite the empty room around them. "I remember it well, as I was visiting the household at the time. The physicians feared for her life for nearly 2 weeks. When she finally recovered, everyone expected celebration, relief that the child had survived such a terrible ordeal." "But that is not what happened?" Damien asked. "Lord Edmund had hoped, I believe, that the illness might resolve itself quickly and quietly, without significant expense or disruption to the household's affairs," the woman said carefully. "When it dragged on, and when Ilara's recovery proved slower and more complicated than anticipated, requiring ongoing care and attention, I fear the family's patience wore thin rather quickly. Lady Margaret, in particular, seemed to view the child's continued frailty as a burden, rather than something requiring compassion." Damien felt his jaw tighten at her words, anger rising steadily within him on Ilara's behalf. And how did that burden manifest itself precisely? The woman hesitated, clearly uncomfortable continuing further, though she eventually spoke again, her voice lower still. "There were times, Your Grace, when the child's episodes of weakness were met with impatience rather than care. I recall an incident, though I did not witness it directly myself, in which young Alara collapsed during a family gathering, and rather than summoning immediate assistance, she was scolded afterward for disrupting the event with what her mother termed unnecessary theatrics. She was blamed for her own illness, Damien said quietly, more to himself than to the woman across from him. I fear that became something of a pattern within that household, Your Grace, the woman said. The family found it far easier to treat her condition as a personal failing, rather than a genuine physical ailment requiring proper attention. I always found it deeply troubling, though it was not my place, as a guest within their home, to intervene. Damien thanked the woman for her honesty before departing, his mind heavy with everything he had learned. He returned to Ashcombe Estate later that evening, his thoughts consumed entirely by the growing realization of exactly what kind of life Alara had endured before their marriage, and exactly what role his own actions had played in perpetuating her suffering, even if unintentionally. He found himself standing outside her chamber door once more that night, though this time he did knock, gently, waiting for her soft acknowledgement before entering. Alara sat near the window as she often did in the evenings, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the evening chill, her expression calm despite the lateness of the hour. Your Grace, she said, slightly surprised by his visit, is something wrong? I have been asking questions, Damien said, choosing directness over the careful diplomacy he might have preferred under different circumstances. About your family, about your childhood illness. Ilara's expression shifted subtly, a flicker of wariness crossing her features before settling back into calm composure. That seems an unusual use of your time, Your Grace. I wanted to understand, Damien said simply. I have learned things that trouble me deeply, about how your family treated you following your illness. And what have you learned, precisely? Alara asked, her voice carefully neutral. Damien hesitated, uncertain how much detail to share, though he ultimately decided honesty was the only path forward that felt appropriate, given everything he now understood. I have learned that your recovery was treated as an inconvenience rather than a relief, that your continued weakness was met with impatience rather than compassion, that you were, at times, blamed for episodes entirely beyond your control. Alara remained silent for a long moment, her gaze drifting toward the window, though Damien suspected she was not truly looking at anything beyond the glass, but rather retreating briefly into memories she rarely allowed herself to revisit so directly. You have learned correctly, she said finally, her voice quiet but steady. Though I admit, I am surprised you took the trouble to learn it at all. Why would that surprise you? Damien asked. Because you married me to punish my family, Your Grace, Alara said simply. Understanding the details of my suffering was never part of that arrangement, as far as I was aware. Her words struck him with unexpected force, a reminder of exactly how their marriage had begun, and exactly how little consideration he had originally given to her well-being, beyond its usefulness in wounding her family. That was true when this began, he admitted. I am not certain it remains entirely true now. Alara looked at him carefully, searching his expression for something she seemed uncertain she would find. What are you saying, precisely? I am saying that I did not fully understand what I was asking of you when I demanded this marriage, Damien said. I saw an opportunity to wound your family and took it without considering what it might mean for you personally, beyond serving as an instrument of my anger. Learning what I have learned these past days has made it considerably more difficult to view you simply as that instrument. Alara studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable, before finally speaking again. I appreciate your honesty, Your Grace, though I confess I am uncertain what to make of this shift in your perspective. Neither am I, entirely, Damien admitted, surprising himself with the vulnerability of the confession. But I intend to ensure that whatever suffering you have endured previously does not continue within these walls, regardless of how this marriage began. Alara nodded slowly, though she said nothing further, and Damien, sensing the conversation had reached its natural conclusion for the evening, offered a small bow before turning to leave her chamber, his mind still heavy with everything he had learned and everything he now felt responsible for reconsidering. As he made his way back toward his own quarters, Damien found himself reflecting on the man he had been only weeks earlier, a man consumed entirely by wounded pride and a desire for vengeance that had blinded him to the humanity of the person he sought to use as its instrument. Whatever path lay ahead within this marriage, he understood now that continuing along that same careless path was no longer something he was willing to accept, regardless of how the arrangement had originally been intended. The change in Damien's behavior did not happen all at once, but rather unfolded gradually over the following weeks, noticeable first in small gestures that Alara might have overlooked entirely, had she not grown increasingly attentive to the shifting dynamics within her new household. He began joining her for breakfast more regularly, no longer disappearing immediately into his study the moment the meal concluded. He asked after her well-being each morning, not as a formality, but with genuine attention to her answer, waiting patiently, rather than moving quickly past the question as he once had. Colin noticed the shift as well, though he said nothing directly, simply adjusting the household's routines subtly to accommodate what appeared to be a growing closeness between the Duke and his previously overlooked wife. Meals were arranged with both of their preferences considered, rather than solely following Damien's established habits as they had before. The staff, taking their cues from Colin's quiet adjustments, began treating Alara with noticeably greater warmth, no longer hesitant to engage her in brief, friendly conversation as they went about their duties. Alara, for her part, remained cautious despite these changes, uncertain whether to trust a shift in attitude from a man who had, only weeks earlier, made his intentions toward her painfully clear. Yet she found herself, almost against her own better judgment, gradually lowering some of the careful walls she had built around herself over many years of disappointment. One afternoon, as she tended to the garden alongside Nora, she noticed Damien approaching from across the lawn, his usual formal attire replaced by simpler clothing, suited to riding, suggesting he had just returned from one of his frequent excursions across the estate's grounds. "You have made remarkable progress here," he said, gesturing toward the roses that now bloomed in vibrant color along the previously neglected path. "It has taken considerable effort," Alara admitted, straightening slowly from where she had been kneeling beside a particularly stubborn patch of weeds. "Though I find I enjoy the work far more than I expected to. My mother tended these roses herself, many years ago," Damien said, his voice softening slightly at the memory. "She passed when I was quite young, and the garden was left largely untouched after her death. I confess I had almost forgotten how beautiful it once was, until you began restoring it." Alara looked at him with quiet surprise, this being the first time he had shared anything personal about his own past since their marriage began. "I am sorry for your loss," she said gently. "It must have been difficult, losing her so young." "It was," Damien admitted, "though I have not spoken of it often, even within my own household. It seems, somehow, easier to mention it here, in this garden she once loved so dearly." Their conversation continued for some time that afternoon, drifting between lighter subjects and occasional moments of deeper reflection, each cautiously sharing small pieces of themselves that had remained hidden during the earlier, colder weeks of their marriage. Nora, sensing the growing intimacy of the exchange, quietly excused herself to attend to other duties, leaving the Duke and his wife alone among the roses. As the days passed, such conversations became increasingly frequent, occurring not only in the garden but during shared meals, quiet evenings in the study, and even occasional walks along the estate's grounds, when Alara felt strong enough to manage the exertion. Damien found himself looking forward to these moments, with an eagerness that unsettled him slightly, given how recently his feelings toward his wife had been rooted entirely in anger and calculated cruelty, rather than genuine interest or affection. Yet not everyone within the household viewed this growing closeness favorably. Word of the shifting dynamics between the Duke and his previously overlooked wife had begun spreading beyond the estate's walls, reaching the ears of certain nobles who had long speculated about the true nature of the arrangement. Among those most displeased by these rumors was Clarissa, who received word of her sister's apparent contentment through a distant cousin who maintained correspondence with several members of Ashcombe's household staff. The news struck Clarissa with unexpected irritation, a feeling she struggled to fully understand herself. She had expected, when the Duke first demanded her sister's hand as punishment, that Alara would suffer considerably within the cold, unfamiliar household of a man motivated entirely by revenge. The idea that her sister might instead be finding some measure of happiness and stability there disrupted the narrative she had constructed for herself, one in which her own actions carried no lasting consequence beyond a temporarily damaged reputation that would fade with time. determined to understand the situation more fully, and perhaps, though she would not have admitted it even to herself, driven by an uncomfortable pang of something resembling guilt, Clarissa arranged a visit to Ashcombe Estate, under the guise of familial concern for her sister's well-being. Her arrival, announced only a day in advance through a brief letter, caught the household somewhat unprepared, though Damien, upon learning of the impending visit, made it clear to his staff that Clarissa would be received with proper courtesy, regardless of his own lingering resentment toward her role in the events that had brought Ilara into his life. Ilara herself received the news of her sister's visit with a complicated mixture of emotions, uncertain whether to expect genuine concern or simply another opportunity for Clarissa to assert whatever remaining sense of superiority she still felt over her younger sibling. "You seem troubled," Damien observed, noticing the subtle tension in Ilara's posture as they discussed the arrangements for Clarissa's arrival over dinner the evening before. "My sister rarely visits without purpose," Ilara said carefully. "I confess, I am uncertain what has prompted this particular visit, given how little concern she showed for my circumstances when I was first brought here." "Whatever her intentions," Damien said, his voice firm, "you need not face her alone, nor allow her presence to disrupt the peace you have worked so hard to establish within this household." Ilara offered him a small, grateful smile, though the tension remained visible in her expression as she considered the coming visit. "Thank you, Your Grace. I appreciate your support, more than you may realize." The following afternoon, Clarissa's carriage arrived at Ashcombe Estate precisely on schedule, and she emerged looking every bit as elegant and composed as she had during their final encounter at Ashford Manor weeks earlier. Her expression, however, carried a subtle wariness as she took in the grandeur of Damien's estate, clearly uncertain what reception awaited her. Ilara greeted her sister at the entrance, her expression polite, though carefully guarded, while Damien stood a short distance behind, observing the exchange with quiet attention. "Sister," Clarissa said, offering a brief, formal embrace that felt more obligatory than genuinely affectionate. "You look well, better than I expected, truthfully." "Thank you for coming," Ilara replied evenly, choosing not to comment directly on the underlying implication of her sister's words. "I hope your journey was comfortable." "Comfortable enough," Clarissa said, glancing briefly toward Damien, with an expression that mixed curiosity and something closer to unease. "Your Grace," she added, offering a slight, formal bow in his direction. "Lady Clarissa," Damien replied, his tone civil, though carrying an unmistakable coolness that made clear his lingering feelings toward her remained largely unresolved, despite the changes that had occurred within his marriage to her sister. The visit proceeded with careful, polite conversation over the following hours, Clarissa inquiring about Ilara's health and circumstances with a formality that suggested genuine curiosity, mixed uncomfortably with lingering discomfort about her own role in the events that had led her sister here. As the afternoon wore on, however, subtle cracks began appearing in Clarissa's composed exterior, moments of thinly veiled irritation surfacing whenever the conversation turned toward the evident warmth developing between Damien and Ilara. It became increasingly clear, as the visit continued, that Clarissa had arrived not simply out of concern for her sister's well-being, but with an underlying discomfort at witnessing Ilara, the sister she had spent years overshadowing and dismissing, apparently finding contentment and even happiness within circumstances Clarissa had assumed would only bring her further suffering. That evening, as the sisters found themselves briefly alone in the estate's drawing room while Damien attended to a matter with his estate manager, Clarissa's carefully maintained composure finally began to slip, revealing glimpses of the true feelings she had carried into this visit. "You seem quite settled here," Clarissa said, her voice carrying a lightness that did not quite mask the sharper edge beneath it. "I confess I did not expect that, given how this marriage began." "Circumstances change," Ilara replied carefully, sensing the shift in her sister's tone, even before the conversation fully revealed its true direction. "Do they?" Clarissa said, rising from her seat to walk slowly toward the window, her back turned to her sister as she spoke. "It seems rather convenient, does it not, that you have managed to secure such comfort and apparent affection from a man who married you purely out of spite. One might almost think you had planned it this way." Ilara felt a familiar tightness settle in her chest, though she kept her voice steady despite the sting of her sister's implication. "I did not plan any of this, Clarissa. I was given no choice in the matter, as you well know." having been present when our parents handed me over as compensation for your own broken promise. Clarissa turned back to face her, something brittle flashing behind her carefully composed expression. I did what was necessary for my own future. You cannot fault me for protecting my own interests. I do not fault you for changing your mind, Alara said quietly. I fault you for allowing me to bear the consequences of that decision, without a single word of concern for what it might mean for my own life. And yet here you sit, Clarissa said, her voice sharpening further, comfortable, cared for, apparently even cherished, by a man who initially wanted nothing more than to use you as a weapon against our family. Perhaps you should be thanking me, rather than resenting me, sister. Alara studied her sister carefully, recognizing in that moment the deep insecurity hidden beneath Clarissa's carefully maintained confidence, an insecurity that had likely driven much of her behavior throughout their shared childhood. Is that truly what troubles you, Clarissa? Not concern for my well-being, but discomfort at seeing me find some measure of happiness you did not expect me to have? The question landed with visible impact, Clarissa's composure faltering slightly before she quickly recovered, though her voice remained tighter than before. Do not presume to understand my feelings, Alara. You have always been given special consideration within our family, despite your weakness, while I was expected to carry the burden of our family's reputation entirely on my own. Special consideration? Alara repeated, disbelief coloring her voice for the first time during the conversation. I was hidden away, Clarissa, treated as an embarrassment rather than a daughter deserving of care. I was blamed for my own illness, scolded for episodes entirely beyond my control, and left to manage severe pain largely on my own, because calling for help so often resulted in frustration rather than comfort. If that is your understanding of special consideration, I fear you understood very little of what actually occurred within our own household. Clarissa's expression shifted through several emotions in quick succession: surprise, discomfort, and finally something that looked almost like genuine uncertainty, as though she were reconsidering, perhaps for the first time, the version of events she had constructed for herself over many years. It was at this moment that Damien returned to the drawing room, having concluded his business with the estate manager sooner than expected. He paused in the doorway, sensing immediately the tension that had settled heavily over the room, though he said nothing at first, simply observing the exchange between the two sisters carefully. I believe, Clarissa said finally, straightening herself and reclaiming some measure of her earlier composure, that I have overstayed my visit. I should return home before the evening grows too late. Perhaps that would be best, Alara said, her voice steady, despite the emotional weight of the conversation that had just concluded between them. Damien stepped further into the room as Clarissa gathered her things, his expression carefully neutral, though his eyes carried an unmistakable coldness as he addressed her directly, for the first time since her arrival earlier that day. Lady Clarissa, before you depart, I would like a brief word, if you would permit it. Clarissa hesitated, clearly uncertain what such a request might entail, though she nodded stiffly in agreement. Alara, sensing the shift in the room, quietly excused herself, leaving her sister and husband alone to speak privately. Your Grace, Clarissa said carefully, once Alara had left the room, I hope my visit has not caused any undue difficulty within your household. I overheard enough of your conversation with Alara to understand the true nature of your visit here today, Damien said, his voice carrying a quiet intensity that made Clarissa visibly uncomfortable. You did not come out of genuine concern for your sister's well-being. You came because you could not bear the possibility that she might find contentment within circumstances you assumed would only bring her further suffering. Clarissa's face paled slightly at his words, though she attempted to maintain her composure. That is not entirely fair, Your Grace. I simply wish to understand her circumstances better, given how unusual this arrangement began. I think we both understand the truth of your visit here today, Lady Clarissa, Damien said, his tone leaving little room for further argument. I would ask that any future communication with your sister be conducted with far greater consideration for her feelings than you have shown thus far, both during your visit today and throughout the years preceding it. You speak as though you know everything about our family's history, Clarissa said, a defensive edge creeping into her voice despite her clear discomfort. I know enough, Damien said simply. I know that your sister spent years being blamed for an illness entirely beyond her control. I know that her suffering was treated as an inconvenience rather than a genuine concern deserving of compassion, and I know that whatever role I played in bringing her into this household, I have come to understand her worth far more clearly than her own family ever seemed to." Clarissa said nothing for a long moment, clearly struggling to formulate a response to words that struck uncomfortably close to truths she had perhaps never fully allowed herself to acknowledge. Finally, she simply nodded, offering a quiet, "I understand, Your Grace," before gathering the last of her belongings and making her way toward the entrance, where her carriage waited to carry her back to Ashford Manor. After she departed, Damien found Elara in the garden once more, seated on the familiar stone bench beneath the fading evening light, her expression thoughtful as she processed the difficult conversation that had unfolded earlier that day. "I am sorry you were forced to endure that conversation with your sister," Damien said, settling onto the bench beside her. "It was not entirely unexpected," Elara said quietly. "Clarissa has always struggled to see beyond her own circumstances, even when those circumstances directly affected the people around her." "You handled it with remarkable grace," Damien said, studying her carefully. "More grace, I think, than she deserved from you." Elara offered a small, tired smile. "Perhaps. Though I confess, hearing her attempt to reframe my suffering as some form of special treatment left me more unsettled than I expected it to." "You need not carry the weight of her misunderstanding," Damien said gently. "Whatever she chooses to believe about your family's history, I have seen enough evidence myself to understand the truth of what you endured, regardless of how your sister chooses to remember it." Elara looked at him carefully, something in his expression offering a quiet comfort she had not expected to find so readily within this marriage that had begun under such difficult circumstances. "Thank you, Damien," she said softly, using his given name for the first time since their marriage began. The small shift did not go unnoticed by either of them, a quiet acknowledgement of the growing bond that had developed between them, gradually replacing the anger and resentment that had once defined their relationship with something considerably warmer and more genuine than either had anticipated when this arrangement first began. The weeks following Clarissa's visit brought a deeper sense of ease to Ashcombe Estate, a quiet contentment settling over the household as Damien and Elara continued to grow closer, their conversations lengthening, their shared silences becoming more comfortable rather than strained. Yet beneath this growing warmth, Elara's underlying condition remained a constant, unpredictable presence, one that neither of them could fully control despite Dr. Whitfield's careful guidance and the greater attention now being paid to her well-being. It happened on a night that had begun ordinarily enough, with a quiet dinner shared between them followed by a gentle walk through the garden beneath a clear, star-filled sky. Elara had seemed in good spirits, her energy steady throughout the evening, giving no indication of the crisis that would unfold only hours later. Damien had retired to his own chambers sometime after midnight, his mind occupied with pleasant thoughts of the evening they had just shared, when a frantic knocking at his door pulled him abruptly from his rest. Nora stood in the hallway, her face pale with fear, her voice trembling as she delivered news that sent a cold jolt of alarm through Damien's entire body. "Your Grace, it is the Duchess. Something is terribly wrong." Damien did not wait for further explanation, moving quickly through the hallways toward Elara's chamber, with a speed that surprised even himself. He found her collapsed near her bed, her breathing shallow and labored, her skin pale and damp with sweat, her lips carrying a faint bluish tint that immediately confirmed the severity of whatever crisis had gripped her. "Elara," he said, kneeling quickly beside her, his voice tight with a fear he had never before experienced so acutely. "Elara, can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open weakly, recognition flickering briefly across her features, before another wave of pain seemed to overtake her, her body tensing as she struggled to draw breath properly. "Damien," she managed weakly, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Send for Dr. Whitfield immediately," Damien said sharply to Nora, who had followed him into the room. "Do not wait for morning. Send someone now, regardless of the hour." Nora rushed from the room to relay the urgent instruction, while Damien remained beside Elara, gently lifting her into a more supported position against the bed, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to steady her while offering whatever comfort he could manage. "Stay with me," he said, his voice carrying an urgency he had never allowed himself to show before. "Please, Elara, stay with me." Elara's eyes remained partially closed, her breathing continuing in short, difficult gasps, though she seemed to register his words, her hand weakly gripping his own, as though drawing whatever strength she could from his presence beside her. The wait for Dr. Whitfield's arrival felt endless to Damien, each passing minute stretching unbearably as he remained beside Alara, doing everything within his limited knowledge to keep her calm and comfortable, though the fear, gripping his own chest, made it difficult to maintain any semblance of composure himself. When Dr. Whitfield finally arrived, rushing into the chamber with his medical bag already open in his hands, Damien reluctantly stepped back to allow him space to work, though he remained close enough to watch every movement, every careful examination the physician performed. "Her heart is under considerable strain," Dr. Whitfield said, after several tense minutes of examination, his voice calm, despite the seriousness of the situation. "This is precisely the kind of episode I warned you about, Your Grace. We must act quickly to stabilize her." The following hour passed in a blur of careful medical attention, Dr. Whitfield administering treatments Damien did not fully understand, his own role reduced simply to remaining present, offering whatever quiet support he could manage, while the physician worked to ease Alara's suffering. Gradually, her breathing began to steady, the dangerous tint fading slowly from her lips as color began returning to her cheeks. Dr. Whitfield finally stepped back, wiping his hands with visible relief, evident in his own expression. "She will recover," he said, addressing Damien directly. "This episode was severe, more severe than any I have witnessed in her previously, but she has weathered it. She will need rest, considerable rest, over the coming days." Damien felt a wave of relief wash over him so intense that his knees nearly buckled beneath its weight. He had not fully understood, until this moment, exactly how deeply his feelings for Alara had grown, nor how genuinely terrifying the prospect of losing her had become. "Thank you," he said quietly to the physician, his voice carrying an emotion he made no effort to hide. "Thank you for reaching her in time." Dr. Whitfield studied the Duke carefully, something knowing in his expression, as he observed the raw concern still evident on Damien's face. "Your Grace, if I may offer some observation beyond simply medical matters, I believe the Duchess is fortunate to have found herself in a household where her well-being is now taken so seriously. Whatever difficulties brought this marriage into being, it seems clear that genuine care has developed between you both." Damien said nothing in response, simply nodding his gratitude before the physician departed, leaving him alone with Alara once more, as she rested quietly, her breathing finally steady and even. He remained seated beside her bed throughout the remainder of the night, unwilling to leave her side even as exhaustion began weighing heavily on his own body. When dawn's first light finally began filtering through the chamber's windows, Alara's eyes opened slowly, focusing gradually on his face, as awareness returned fully to her. "You stayed," she said weakly, her voice still carrying traces of the exhaustion from her ordeal. "I could not leave," Damien said simply, his voice rough with emotion he no longer felt the need to conceal. "I have never been so afraid in my entire life as I was tonight, watching you struggle for breath, uncertain whether you would recover." Alara studied him carefully, something shifting in her expression as she absorbed the depth of feeling, evident in his words, and his exhausted, tear-streaked face. "I did not realize my condition could cause you such distress," she said softly. "Neither did I. Until tonight," Damien admitted. "I have spent weeks, slowly coming to understand what kind of woman you truly are, Alara, beneath the frailty your family always emphasized. Watching you fight for your life tonight made me realize something I should have understood far sooner." "What is that?" Alara asked quietly, her hand still resting weakly within his own. "That I care for you," Damien said, his voice steady, despite the vulnerability of the admission, "not as an instrument of revenge against your family, not as a duty I am obligated to protect, but as a woman I have come to genuinely cherish, far beyond anything I anticipated when this marriage began." Alara's eyes glistened with unshed tears at his words, though a small, genuine smile spread across her tired features. "I confess, Damien, I have found myself feeling similarly these past weeks, though I did not wish to presume too much given how this arrangement first came to be." Damien gently squeezed her hand, relief and tenderness mixing together within his chest as he studied her exhausted but alert expression. "Then let us presume together, from this moment forward, that whatever began this marriage matters far less than what we choose to build from here. Elara nodded weakly, her eyes finally closing again, as exhaustion overtook her once more. Though this time, her breathing remained steady and calm, her hand still resting gently within Damien's own, as he continued his quiet vigil beside her bed, watching over her with a devotion that bore no resemblance whatsoever to the anger and vengeance that had first brought them together. News of Elara's near-fatal episode eventually reached Ashford Manor, through the same channels that had carried word of her earlier contentment, and within days, Lord Edmund and Lady Margaret arrived at Ashcombe Estate, their expressions carrying a mixture of concern and unmistakable anxiety about how their daughter's illness, and its potential consequences for the family's reputation, might reflect upon them. Damien received them coolly in the estate's main hall, his earlier anger toward the Ashford family resurging at the sight of the parents who had spent years neglecting their youngest daughter's genuine needs. "Your Grace," Lord Edmund began, his voice carrying forced warmth. "We came as soon as we heard of Elara's episode. We are, of course, deeply concerned for her well-being." "Are you?" Damien said, his tone carrying a sharp edge he made no effort to soften. "Forgive me if I find that difficult to believe, given everything I have learned about how her condition was managed within your household." Lady Margaret's face paled slightly at his words. "Your Grace, we did the best we could for her, given the circumstances. Her illness was always complicated." "Her illness was complicated," Damien repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "Yet somehow your family managed to treat her recovery as an embarrassment rather than a miracle. You blamed her for episodes entirely beyond her control. You left her to manage severe pain largely on her own, because addressing it properly proved inconvenient to your daily lives." "That is an unfair characterization," Lord Edmund protested, though his voice lacked genuine conviction. It was at this moment that Elara herself appeared at the top of the staircase, having insisted on rising from her bed, despite Dr. Whitfield's continued recommendations for rest, drawn by the sound of her parents' voices echoing through the hall below. "Elara," Lady Margaret said, her voice softening slightly at the sight of her daughter, though the underlying discomfort in her expression remained evident. "You gave us quite a fright, my dear." "Did I?" Elara said, descending the stairs slowly, her voice carrying a calm steadiness that nonetheless held an unfamiliar firmness Damien had not heard from her before. "I confess, I find that somewhat difficult to believe, Mother, given how little concern was shown for similar episodes throughout my childhood." Lady Margaret's face flushed slightly at the direct challenge, clearly unaccustomed to such open confrontation from her typically quiet daughter. "We always did what we believed was best for you, Elara. You believed it was best to scold me for collapsing during family gatherings," Elara said, her voice steady, despite the emotional weight of her words. "You believed it was best to call my illness dramatics rather than genuine physical suffering. You believed it was best to leave me alone during my most severe episodes, because addressing them properly proved inconvenient and, I suspect, frightening to acknowledge." Lord Edmund shifted uncomfortably, clearly unprepared for such direct accusations, delivered so calmly by the daughter he had always assumed too weak, both physically and emotionally, to challenge her family's treatment of her. "Elara, we are your parents. Everything we did came from a place of concern, however imperfectly expressed. Perhaps you believe that," Elara said quietly. "Perhaps you have told yourselves that story so many times over the years that you have come to believe it entirely. But I lived through those years, Father. I remember every scolding, every dismissed request for help, every moment I was made to feel ashamed of a condition I never asked for and could never control. Whatever comfort that story provides you, it does not match the reality I experienced." The hall fell into heavy silence following her words, Lord Edmund and Lady Margaret both visibly struggling to formulate any response that might adequately address the truth their daughter had finally spoken aloud after years of quiet endurance. Damien, watching Elara stand firm before her parents with a strength he had not fully witnessed until this moment, felt a surge of pride mixed with lingering anger toward the family who had caused her such unnecessary suffering. "I believe," he said finally, breaking the silence that had settled over the room, "that this conversation has revealed everything necessary for a clear understanding of how this family treated its youngest daughter throughout her life." "Your Grace," Lord Edmund began, though Damien raised a hand to silence him before he could continue. I did not marry your daughter out of concern for her well-being, Damien said, his voice carrying a firm clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. I married her out of anger toward this family, intending to use her as a means of inflicting the same kind of pain you had caused me through your daughter's broken promise. I am not proud of that decision, nor of the reasoning that led to it. He paused, glancing toward Alara with an expression that had softened considerably from the coldness with which he had first addressed her parents. But in the weeks since, I have come to understand exactly what kind of woman your family so carelessly overlooked and mistreated. I have come to see her strength, her resilience, and her quiet grace, qualities she developed not because of your guidance, but in spite of your neglect. Lady Margaret's eyes filled with tears, though whether from genuine remorse or simply discomfort at being confronted so directly, remained unclear.
We never intended for her to suffer so greatly, she said quietly. Intentions matter little when the consequences remain the same, Damien said.
Your daughter nearly lost her life recently, and had she done so, I fear this family would have mourned the loss of a symbol of embarrassment, rather than a genuine daughter deeply loved and valued. That is a truth I hope you will carry with you long after you leave this estate today. Alara stepped forward then, standing beside Damien rather than remaining apart from him, as she had throughout much of the conversation, a quiet but powerful demonstration of the bond that had grown between them over the preceding weeks. I do not say these things to punish you further. Mother, father, she said, her voice softening slightly, though the firmness beneath it remained unmistakable. I say them because I deserve, finally, to have my experiences acknowledged honestly, rather than reshaped into something more comfortable for you to accept. Lord Edmund and Lady Margaret exchanged uncertain glances, clearly uncertain how to respond to a daughter who had, for the first time in her life, spoken so directly and confidently about the treatment she had endured. Finally, Lord Edmund nodded slowly, something resembling genuine regret finally surfacing in his expression. We will leave you to your recovery, he said quietly. Perhaps, in time, we might find a way to rebuild what has clearly been broken between us for many years. Perhaps, Alara said, though her tone offered no immediate promise of reconciliation, simply an acknowledgement that the possibility, however distant, remained open, should genuine change eventually follow their words. As her parents departed the estate shortly afterward, Alara remained standing beside Damien in the quiet hall, a mixture of exhaustion and relief settling over her, following the difficult confrontation she had finally allowed herself to voice after years of silent endurance. That took considerable courage, Damien said gently, turning to face her fully. I have wanted to say those words for a very long time, Alara admitted, her voice carrying quiet emotion. I simply never believed anyone would stand beside me while I spoke them. Damien reached out gently, taking her hand in his own, with a tenderness that had become natural between them over recent weeks. You will never need to face such moments alone again, Alara. Not while I remain by your side. Alara looked up at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, though her expression carried a warmth and gratitude that spoke more clearly than any words could of how deeply their relationship had transformed since the bitter, vengeful beginning that had first brought them together. In the months that followed the difficult confrontation with Alara's parents, life at Ashcombe Estate settled into a warmth and stability that neither Damien nor Alara could have imagined when their marriage first began under such bitter circumstances. Alara's health, while still requiring careful management, improved steadily under Dr. Whitfield's continued guidance, and the genuine care now shown to her within her own household. The garden she had lovingly restored bloomed more vibrantly than ever, a quiet symbol of the life and warmth that had similarly grown within the estate's previously cold walls. Word of the Duke's evident devotion to his once overlooked wife spread gradually throughout noble society, transforming the narrative that had originally surrounded their marriage. What began as a story of vengeance and calculated cruelty had, through the genuine care and respect that developed between them, become instead a quiet testament to unexpected devotion, one that many within their social circle found themselves discussing with genuine admiration, rather than the scandalous curiosity that had initially surrounded the union. Damien decided, as the anniversary of their first meeting approached, that a formal celebration was warranted, not to mark the anger and revenge that had originally brought them together, but rather to honor the genuine partnership that had grown from such difficult beginnings. He arranged a gathering at Ashcombe Estate, inviting members of noble society who had once whispered about the scandal of his marriage to the frail, forgotten Ashford daughter. Ilara, initially hesitant about facing society so directly, after years of being hidden away by her own family, found unexpected strength in Damien's steady support as they prepared for the event together. "You need not prove anything to these people," Damien said gently, as they discussed the arrangements one evening in his study. "This gathering is simply an opportunity to celebrate what we have built together, regardless of how others may have once viewed our beginning." "I know," Ilara said, though a flicker of nervousness remained visible in her expression. "It is simply strange, after so many years of being kept from social gatherings, to now stand at the center of one." "You will not stand there alone," Damien said, taking her hand gently. "I intend to remain firmly by your side throughout the entire evening, and for every gathering that follows in the years ahead." On the evening of the celebration, Ashcombe Estate glowed with warm candlelight, as nobles from across the region gathered within its grand halls, the very same halls that had once witnessed Ilara's quiet, isolated arrival months earlier. She descended the staircase that evening, dressed not in her sister's old, ill-fitting gown, but in attire chosen specifically for her, tailored carefully to complement rather than hide her slender frame, a quiet symbol of how thoroughly her circumstances had transformed since her first arrival at this estate. Damien waited at the bottom of the staircase, watching her descend with an expression of open admiration that drew quiet murmurs of approval from the gathered guests, many of whom had expected, given the scandalous origins of this marriage, to witness something considerably more strained and uncomfortable than the genuine warmth now evident between the Duke and his wife. "You look radiant," Damien said softly, as she reached the bottom step and took his offered arm. "I feel radiant," Ilara admitted, a genuine smile spreading across her features as she surveyed the gathered guests, many of whom offered warm, genuine greetings, rather than the curious, judgmental glances she might once have expected from noble society. As the evening progressed, Damien rose before the assembled guests, requesting a brief moment of their attention before continuing with a speech he had carefully prepared over the preceding days. "Many of you," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the grand hall, "are aware of the unusual circumstances that first brought Ilara and myself together. I will not pretend that our marriage began under noble intentions. I sought, in my anger, to punish a family who had wronged me, and I chose Ilara as the instrument of that punishment, without proper consideration for her own well-being or worth." Murmurs rippled through the crowd at his surprisingly direct admission, though Damien continued without hesitation, his gaze finding Ilara's own as he spoke. "What I discovered, in the months since our marriage began, was a woman of extraordinary strength and grace, one whose own family had spent years overlooking and mistreating her, hiding her away as though her worth were somehow diminished by an illness entirely beyond her control. I discovered resilience where I expected fragility, quiet wisdom where I expected simplicity, and a depth of character that has fundamentally reshaped my understanding of what genuine partnership and devotion truly mean." He turned fully to face Ilara now, taking both her hands gently within his own, as the gathered guests watched in respectful silence, sensing the genuine emotion behind his words. "I stand before you all today," Damien continued, his voice carrying quiet conviction, "not simply as a husband fulfilling an obligation, born of anger and revenge, but as a man who has come to genuinely and deeply cherish the woman standing beside me. Ilara, whatever circumstances first brought us together, I wish to renew my commitment to you now, freely and completely, choosing you not out of anger toward your family, but out of genuine love and admiration for exactly who you are." Ilara's eyes filled with tears at his words, genuine emotion overwhelming her composed exterior as she absorbed the depth of his public declaration. "Damien," she said softly, her voice carrying through the quiet hall despite its gentleness, "I never imagined, when I was called down those stairs months ago to face a husband, motivated entirely by vengeance, that I might one day stand here, genuinely and completely loved by the very man who once sought only to use me as his instrument of revenge." She paused, gathering herself before continuing, her voice growing steadier with each word. "I have spent much of my life being told, both through words and through neglect, that my worth was somehow diminished by my frailty, that my survival was more inconvenience than miracle. Standing here today, surrounded by genuine warmth and acceptance, I finally understand that my scars, both visible and hidden, were never marks of weakness, but evidence of a strength few ever bothered to recognize. The gathered guests erupted into warm, genuine applause at the conclusion of her words, many wiping away tears of their own, at the evident sincerity and emotion behind the exchange they had just witnessed. Damien gently pulled Ilara into a warm embrace, the two of them standing together at the center of the grand hall, surrounded not by whispers of scandal and revenge, but by genuine celebration of a partnership that had transformed, against all expectation, into something remarkably beautiful. As the celebration continued late into the evening, Damien and Ilara eventually found a quiet moment alone in the garden she had so lovingly restored, the same garden where their bond had first begun to grow months earlier. "Do you have any regrets?" Ilara asked softly, "about how this all began?" Damien considered the question carefully before answering, his gaze drifting toward the roses blooming vibrantly beneath the moonlight. "I regret the anger that drove my initial decision, and I regret not recognizing your worth sooner than I did. But I cannot regret where that difficult beginning has ultimately led us, Ilara. Whatever pain and injustice brought us together, I would not trade the life we have built since for anything." Ilara smiled softly, leaning gently against him as they stood together beneath the stars. "Nor would I," she said quietly. "My family once believed my frailty made me unworthy of genuine love and consideration. You alone chose to look beyond that frailty and discover something they never bothered to see. For that, Damien, I will always be grateful, regardless of how our story first began." They remained together in the quiet garden for a long while, the sounds of the celebration continuing softly behind them, both finally at peace with a beginning rooted in anger and revenge that had, through genuine care, patience, and mutual understanding, transformed into a love neither of them had ever expected to find, yet neither would ever willingly give up.